now we have one more speaker, and last but absolutely not least is Joel Rodgers. The title of Joel's paper is Thomas Middleton's Hengist and the Staging of Early Modern Corporations. Joel is a fellow at the Center for Renaissance and Reformation Studies at the University of Toronto, and he's currently in the process of expanding his 2020 dissertation into a book project called Framed into Corporations, the Politics of Company in Early Modern English Literature. And I'm just very excited to hear you talk about Hengist. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Erin. And thank you everyone for coming today. Are you able to see the slides fine? Awesome. It's always great in our new Zoom world. It's a delight and privilege to be here and to have a chance to speak with such engaged and thoughtful Renaissance scholars in such a strained time. And like others, I want to recognize that I am speaking on what has traditionally been the land of the Huron-Wendat, the Seneca, and most recently the Mississaugas of the Credit River. And I'm grateful for the opportunity to speak and work on this land. My paper today is, as Erin said, is Thomas Middleton's Hengist and the Staging of Early Modern Corporations. And it grows out of my recent doctoral project and its new work. So I really welcome any questions or suggestions for further directions in the Q&A. In the third act of Thomas Middleton's Hengist, King of Kent, a company of townsmen petition the titular Saxon to resolve a dispute over some local business. This business, a barber explains, lies about the head. Hengist jests that such business would indeed befit barber surgeons. Their labor, after all, focuses on the human head. They were responsible for dentistry. The barber, however, tries in vain to correct Hengist, saying, "No, my good lord, there is a corporation, a kind of body, a body." Hengist then dismisses the man's, deciding, "The barber's out of the body, let in the tailor." Grace Iopolo, the play's editor for the collected works, suggests that Hengist mistakes the barber's meaning, thinking the man has been thrust from the body of the Honorable Company of Barber Surgeons, the livery company that would have governed the barber's work. She simultaneously admits, however, the corporation would seem also to be the body off stage, the body of tradesmen off stage. Iopolo's tentative note understates the deliberate comedic confusion about the word corporation in this scene. And it's this confusion that my paper seeks to disentangle today a little bit. This scene hinges on a series of jokes about the body politic, but it actually depends on audiences immediately recognizing a confusion of different forms of corporation and incorporation. Today, the word corporation conjures large economic institutions, Google Limited Liability Company, Amazon.com Incorporated, and other multinational for-profit businesses that benefit their shareholders. Indeed, this economic-oriented sense of the word stems from the invention and expansion of joint stock companies in the 16th and 17th centuries. However, in the same period, the term corporation referred to a number of legal bodies, from the livery and joint stock companies to the governing bodies of schools, colleges, cities, and even the state itself. Famed English jurist Edward Coke called this body the corporation aggregate of many. And by that, he means a group of individual human beings united legally and imaginatively into an artificial body capable of representing a collective interest over time, despite the death of any particular member. For example, elected each year, a mayor and aldermen collectively formed the civic corporation that allowed a town or city to act as a governing body. In this case, Middleton's barber initially invokes not his guild, but the incorporated town from which he feels alienated. Hengist himself recognizes this meaning only a few minutes later, when the tailor clarifies that their business is a dispute over the election of a new mayor to head their civic corporation. Hengist then concludes, it is a patched town. Iopolo, in other words, seems to have missed the corporate forest for the tree, which is the livery company. My point is not to snipe at a great editor and scholar of Middleton's work. That's not what I wanted to do here at all. Rather, I raise this editorial quibble in order to show how easily we can overlook the nuances and elasticity of early modern corporations on stage. As Henry Turner lamented only a few years ago, we remain entrenched in a corporate monoculture, dominated by the for-profit business corporation. And that occludes our ability to recognize the other forms of corporation available to us and to people in the past. Even as literary scholars have recently turned to studying the corporation per se, and in this I include Turner, as well as John O'Brien and Liam Hayden, this work has overwhelmingly focused on the role of the international joint stock companies, Turner accepted. Middleton's play, however, focuses not on these international companies, but on the domestic power of the civic commonwealth that provided English subjects with some legitimacy and was included, if not definitive of, the language of corporations. Middleton represents this form of civic corporation, as well as its affiliated companies, as a major factor in national history. And in the rest of this paper, what I want to suggest is that if we turn to Middleton's play with renewed emphasis on the corporation as an elastic public entity and not solely a guild or private business, then the play starts to cohere as a complex representation of competing national forces that were driving the formation of the nation state in the early 17th century. So what is Middleton's play? In a word, odd. It's Middleton's only straightforward history play, so it's unique among his works. Furthermore, it's written between 1616 and 1620, which means it comes about 2 decades after the genre was popular among playwrights. Here you can think of Shakespeare's tetralogies. The play also has 2 distinct titles, and it exists in 2 distinct authorial forms among 3 textual witnesses. 2 early manuscript versions of the play call it Hengist, King of Kent, while the later printed quarto refers to the play on screen as the Mayor of Queenborough, attesting to the popularity of the subplot in which Simon the Tanner rises from the level of servant to titular mayor. We should see these 2 plots as reflections of each other. As Tomac Roebuck stresses, the local political squabbles mirror and are interrelated with the violence and betrayal in national history. The primary subject matter of the plot remains the ancient British past, as the play retells Vortiger's employment of Saxon mercenaries in a misbegotten attempt to secure the British throne. Middleton spends considerable energy representing this history as a dynastic tragedy that pits Brito-Roman success against Anglo-Saxon wealth. As one gentleman tells Vortiger, "My lord, these Saxons bring a fortune with them, stains any Roman success." But while the play's primary plot focuses on the international drama of ancient history, the play's comedic subplot is definitively early modern and focuses on Hengist's involvement, or lack thereof, in the election of Simon to the mayoralty. Hengist first meets the masterless Simon in the second act, when Simon teaches Hengist how to stretch a leather thong to stake out, quote, the first foundations of his fortune on Britain's earth, end quote. The election of the mayor becomes a mirror for the play's historical questions about monarchical succession and the debts contemporary England owes to the international past. In the manuscript version of the play, Vortiger's first lines make this reflection explicit, as Middleton puts a provocative 17th century simile in the mouth of the 15th century ruler. Vortiger resents that the multitude have denied him sovereign power, and he complains the people will have none as long as Constantine's 3 sons survive, as if the vassals knew not how to obey, but in that line, like their professions, that all their lifetime hammer out one way, beaten into their pates with 7 years bondage. This is on the screen. Vortiger alludes here to the minimum 7 years that apprentices would work in the livery companies before becoming full members. This process was also the primary gateway to becoming a citizen and thereby becoming a member of the city's corporate body. An anonymous 1629 pamphlet written in defense of London's apprentices outright declares that in the body of the city, none generally are incorporated, but such only as through the straight gates of apprenticeship aspire to the dignity and state of citizens. Although someone could become a citizen by birth, or in some cases by redemption, i.e. by buying one's way into citizenship, 9/10 of early modern Londoners achieved citizenship through apprenticeship in one of these companies. While apprenticeships were no guarantee of citizenship, it was the de facto route to acquiring the freedom of the city. From Rodgers' perspective, this process hammers the people into structural obedience and bondage that prevents him from securing the throne. Rodgers' frustration, however, attests to the legitimate power of these political structures for early modern audiences. Consider, for example, John Norden's 1593 map of London. If you look at the map here, the livery companies, their heraldry, quite literally frame the map. But they are accompanied by the presence of the heraldry for the City of London and the monarchy as well, that rest on the landscape just north of the city. So in Norden's map, what I would argue here is that we see the these competing political and corporate identities all existing in one place without being reduced to each other. They exist separate, but in concert, ideally. What I'm arguing with Middleton's Hengist is that Hengist illustrates the competing authorities of Norden's map coming to bear on life in early modern. Middleton, like his contemporary Ben Jonson, was well-versed in this corporate language and culture. Like Jonson, Middleton was the son of a bricklayer, but unlike Jonson, Middleton never joined the company. Like Jonson, Middleton was eventually made London's city chronologer, which was a curious civic poet historian position that's hard to define. And he ascended to that position in 1620, presumably after Hengist was written. Like Jonson, Middleton was also a major contributor to the Lord Mayor's shows, the yearly civic pageants that were sponsored by London's companies. And yesterday we heard Jamie Paris's great paper about Middleton's engagement with racial respectability politics in the lavish civic production of The Triumph of Truth. But a history play offers Middleton a little bit more latitude for critique. As Thomas Roebuck has noted, the corporate shows were largely promotional in their representations of England's capital city, its companies, and its history. By contrast, the history play in the early modern public theaters afforded Middleton the opportunity to depict a less rosy view of the civic world. As Gary Taylor notes, Symonds Queensborough vividly and anachronistically yokes the audience's living world to this lost historical past. Simon the Tanner quickly becomes a petty tyrant, lording his incompetence over the citizens of the play. Middleton also complicates any attempt to draw a genealogy between ancient Britain or ancient British or Saxon identities with early modern England. But even as the play lampoons this electoral process of the early modern civic corporation, Hengist is asked, skipped a line. Even as the play lampoons the electoral process, the play actually affirms the power of these corporations in the end, as Hengist and Simon and the other citizens of London join Hengist, not Voyager, in the play's conclusion. But it is an ambiguous conclusion where it's very difficult to tell where the play falls, if the play is taking a side here. The play might be thus read as a timely comment on the power of these intermediate corporate bodies to intervene in questions of national unity that dominated the early 17th century. In effect, what I'm saying very quickly here is Middleton's untimely experimentation with the history play as a genre becomes a timely reflection of the corporate influences on the emergent nation state. To conclude, quickly, Middleton's conflation of ancient British history with early modern English civic election is not incidental, but integral to his foray into the history genre. Middleton's narrator, the medieval monk, Ranulph Higden, foregrounds this conflation in the opening lines, when he notes that everything old is new again. Ancient stories have been best. Fashions that are now called new have been worn by more than new. Elder times have used the same, though these new ones get the name. So in story, what's now told, that takes not part with the days of old. Then to prove time's mutual glory, join new time's love to old time's story. To some extent, this sort of anachronism is the modus operandi of early modern history plays, if not the early modern theater in general. No one is really concerned to closely represent what Philip Sidney calls the bare was of history. But it is not a lost past that Middleton is representing here. As Lucy Monroe argues, Middleton's play fits into a growing interest among playwrights exploring this Saxon history. Hengist was simultaneously a founder of the English nation and an invading barbarian. Furthermore, this past will soon be foundational for not only English, but American national identity. And here I'd point to Nell Irvin Tainter's work in the History of White People, where she stresses that Hengist and Ursus were touchstones in Thomas Jefferson's imagination of the United States, racial and national identity. While we should be wary of reading any dramatic work as a mimetic representative of its age or its historical moment, as Stephen Rappaport it warns us in his work on early modern cities, he particularly dislikes people using Shakespeare as a mimetic representative of the age. Middleton's play appears at a very critical ideological juncture in Britain and England's national history. In Middleton's case, the ancient Saxon past becomes a tool for refiguring the freedoms of early modern England while potentially criticizing them. Likewise, if we attend to Middleton's sensitivity to these various forms of incorporation, I think that should impel us to reconsider how the joint stock company has dominated our conversations about the corporation and our own histories. It encourages us to ask, what kind of body do we envision of our own communities now? Thank you.
Thank you so much. That was just dazzling, dazzling, dazzling.